Okay, let's get this event started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us in this space. I'm Jess, the new Marketing and Events Manager at Ramsey County Historical Society. We're very pleased to be partnering with Eastside Freedom Library to bring you Shelton Stromquist for this event called Claiming the City. Before we begin, we'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. And the full land acknowledgement can be found on our website as well. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, extend beyond the modern borders of Minnesota and is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples, all who make up a vibrant community in Minnesota Makoche. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota land. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. As I said, you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, as well as a list of everything else we do. A few housekeeping things before we begin. Throughout the presentation, we ask that you keep your microphone muted until the time where discussion or sharing is prompted by the facilitator, which will be Peter. Questions can be addressed using the raise your hand feature or by commenting in the chat at any point during the event. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within a week or so, and is also set up for closed captioning. You can find a full list of our upcoming events on our website. As I mentioned, this event is brought to you in partnership with Eastside Freedom Library, and representing the library here is Clarence White. If you'd like to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Welcome, everyone. So glad you could be here. I just want to say that the Eastside Freedom Library is happy to be part of this event. We also have a lot of events that happen at the Eastside Freedom Library. I am happy to see that John Hansen is here tonight. He, along with the Remember 1934 committee, hello, John, is going to be hosting a screening of a film on the 20th. Now I need to go back to on July 26th, Friday, July 26th. And we will be screening Labor's Turning Point, which is a documentary about the 1934 Teamster strike, and interviews many people who were involved in that really landscape changing event for not just the presence of labor in Minneapolis, but around the country. So we would love it if you could join us for that. And it also reminds me that I have an email that I owe you, John, but we will talk later. And I hope to be talking with all of you that evening. You can see our events at the Eastside Freedom Library webpage, which is eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. We also have a lot of great events, community events coming up at the beginning of August, and we hope you will join us for those as well. One of which will include food. So join us on our lawn, and with that, I'll hand it back over to the folks who you really came to listen to. So thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Clarence, and thank you for partnering with us on this event. You can find more information about the library and all the great work that they do. We'll have the link in the chat. Tonight, we're so thrilled to welcome Shelton Stromquist to RCHS and Eastside Freedom Library in this virtual space. Shelton is a historian specializing in labor and social history and is a lifelong labor and civil rights activist. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including Frontiers of Labor, Reinventing the People, and Labor's Cold War, and most recently, a David Montgomery Reader Essays on Capitalism and Worker Resistance. That one just came out in June, I believe, so it's very, very new. If you should get a copy from your local bookstore. or Shelton's local bookstore, which is Prairie Lights. He is the Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Iowa. So thank you, Shelton, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I hope I can, everyone can hear me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join all of you. And I'm really grateful to the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library for making this opportunity possible for me to talk about my book on municipal socialism and to open up, I hope will be a productive discussion at the end of what I have to say about this history, but also about where we are today. I want to say, sort of by introduction, that over the years, and it's been many years, I got started on this project in 2000, I hesitate to say. But over the course of this work, I've been assisted by scholars, archivists, and political activists who too numerous to mention here, but in the United Kingdom and the United States, obviously, but also Germany, Austria, Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand. I'm grateful to all of them for what they helped me do with this project. But I'm also inspired by the struggles today to defend the legacies that we share from what these folks created in this political tradition of municipal socialism that I try to detail in the book. And I'm also inspired by the kind of new, what's called the new municipalism that is very much alive and well of city activism to try to enable cities to control their destinies and to create or recreate the kind of humane environment that we all aspire to live in. I want to, at this point, I think I'm going to share the screen so that I can have up as I talk a number of images that I think help convey what I'm trying to do in this book. So bear with me while I share the screen. I hope this works. Are you seeing the images?
Yes.
You are. Okay, great. So hang on just a minute. What I'd like to do is sort of just outline quickly the kind of agenda for what I'd like to talk about today. And it may strike you as a big agenda, and my only consolation, or the only consolation I think I have, is that it's also a very big book. So first I want to talk briefly about the argument and the methodology that I used for this book. And I, in the process of that, talk about elite governance and the challenge of parliamentarism to this kind of locally conceived and executed politics, and the related debate over revisionism that took place at very heated at times among socialists, but has a bearing on this history. And I also want to stress the value of local studies, because inherent in this project, which focuses on cities, is the importance of uncovering and excavating these stories as they played out in specific cities and among specific groups of workers. Second, with a focus on the importance of these local stories, I want to stress the unique moment of the 1890s, during which urban workers began to experiment out of necessity with new kinds of politics at the local level. And out of that experimentation emerged what is broadly defined, I think, as municipal socialism, although its incarnation emerged in a variety of party and political forms. But cities became, I think, laboratories for this new politics. And places like Broken Hill, New South Wales, Christchurch, New Zealand, or Malmö, Sweden, Stuttgart, Germany, Hamilton, Ohio, to name only a few, were the places where this politics happened. And the question really is, how did socialist minorities, because they were often small minorities in elected bodies initially, how did they create space for this new politics? And I want to focus in particular on the struggles that sorry, I just got a message that I didn't expect popped up on my screen. What I would like to call the struggles in the trenches of city councils and other municipal bodies that really created the kind of foundation for this new political initiative. In places all the way from Frankfurt, Germany, to Bradford, England, from Redfern in Sydney to Richmond in Melbourne, from Milwaukee to Dayton. The variety of settings was tremendous, and I think that variety, although they had a great deal in common, that variety tells us a lot about what this new politics was. So I'm hoping this is showing up as a slideshow, but maybe not yet. Well, hang on. So this is not the image that I intended to begin with. Let me go back. Okay. Are you seeing? I can't tell from. Oh, now I do. This is an image from the aftermath of the campaign of Thomas Van Leer, who, as you know, was a socialist elected mayor of Minneapolis in November of 1916. But Minneapolis was, along with Two Harbors, Minnesota, and a number of other towns and cities around Minnesota, a place where this politics unfolded as well. And I'm going to have a little more to say about Minneapolis and Two Harbors, especially a little later in the presentation. The third thing that I want to stress is that this was a transnational movement. And I actually like to use the term translocal because it better conveys the sense of rootedness in localities and the international connectedness that these local movements had and developed. And it you know, if you have a chance to look at the book, you'll find a cast of characters, some of whom you may be familiar with, some of whom not, but who are important executors of this politics at the local level, but who also did so in a translocal or transnational way. People like Tom Mann and Ben Tillett from England, and Walter Thomas Mills, the American socialist who found himself deeply involved in the building of a New Zealand Labour Party. Jim Thorne, one of my favorite characters, a railway shop worker from Christchurch, New Zealand. Edward Bernstein, whom you no doubt know, but also Hugo Lindemann from Germany, who was in some ways his sidekick in Stuttgart. Adela Pankhurst of the famous Pankhurst family, who became an anti-war and municipal activist in Australia. Michael Davitt and James Connolly, well-known transnational Irish figures. Vida Goldstein, Stella Henderson, a whole cast of characters whom I found endlessly fascinating as I did this research, and whom if you dip into the book, I hope you'll find as well. Finally, and the fourth segment here, I want to ask us to focus on the pivotal years of World War I and its aftermath, when municipal socialism found a more stable footing, not in the US, but in many parts of the world that I looked at. And really the foundations were laid for rebuilding and enacting this kind of municipal socialism in a very tangible and concrete way in the post-war period. One of the important sites with which many of you are no doubt familiar, where I'm hearing some voices in the background. I don't know what that is, but anyway, one of the important sites that became world famous was Vienna, and the so-called Red Vienna of the post-war period, in which workers really went about in a very tangible and comprehensive way, kind of remaking a municipality under socialist governance that really illustrated, I think, what this movement was all about and what it was trying to enact elsewhere. I'll say more about Red Vienna toward the end, and then I'll conclude with a few comments about how this history has a bearing on our own times. But let me start on a general level with my argument and theoretical orientation, if you will. So I want to argue in this book that municipal socialism was in many ways the seedbed for social democracy in the Western industrialized countries and in their settler colonies in the period 1890 roughly to 1925. This movement had a vitality and an experimentalism that energized social democratic movements more generally, and that connected those movements at the national level with their grassroots. And this is really in many ways very crucial. Hunting for my cursor here. There we go. Without question, I think in the late 1880s and 90s, we witnessed a significant transition with the emergence of municipal socialism as a kind of beating heart, if you will, and that may be overstating it a little bit, of the socialist movement more generally. But this new local politics had an energy and growth in the pre-World War I period that I don't think has been fully appreciated. And even when social democracy as a national movement flagged or was diluted or consumed by nationalism, as it was in many places in World War I, the movement found renewal at the local level, and such a focus, by definition, I think, requires local study. This local history, I would argue, has been way too neglected and even marginalized, while the national and parliamentary arena has been privileged in the history of social democracy. The debate among socialists over what was called revisionism was, at least in part, a debate over parliamentarism versus municipalism. And I'll elaborate on that later in more detail. But it was in city politics, I think, that workers demonstrated the viability of a socialist politics that looked to immediate gains on the path to socialist transformation. Part of the problem here has to do, I think, with the habitualness of the national focus in studies of social democracy. Stefan Berger, the German historian, has spoken of the 19th century as an era of great state nationalism, and that social democrats were not immune. They framed their project in national terms, and this led to a kind of naturalization of the national. Class narratives became alternative national narratives. And the parliamentary Labor or Socialist Party inevitably constituted the primary story. Its history provided the narrative spine. The parliamentary undertow of this history and this practice submerged municipal agendas, belittled their struggles as marginal and kind of beside the point, and washed their platforms to the margins of these nationalizing parties. One of the consequences, I think, has been to kind of enshrine national exceptionalism in some of this history, and that has a lot to do with the way in which the history of socialism in the United States has been treated. But it seems to me that the exceptional, if you will, looks a lot different at the level of the municipality. And the old Sombart question that we used to make fun of, why no socialism in the US? It turns out that at least at the local level, the US was hardly exceptional. In fact, in an international context, what was happening in the US at the municipal level looked very much like what was going on elsewhere. So I want to, so part of the subtext here is to challenge that notion of US exceptionalism, or at least in some ways to complicate it. And I hope I hope I've been able to do that. In doing this, I've drawn on the kind of emphasis on local studies that was very much at the heart of the New Labor history and the tradition of community studies that were influential in that work. And I think that helps us provide some alternative models for how to go about reconstructing this history. So I proceeded in this project from a conviction that local study was vital. And that has been central to my own scholarship over the years in a variety of projects. At the local level, it seems to me we can grapple with the human dimension of historical change, with the variability of experience, and with the agency, most importantly, of ordinary people and their stories. And frankly, I think that's where the most interesting action was, and maybe the most valuable and instructive for us in our own times. So one of the challenges with this project was finding sources that were going to enable me to kind of do this reconstruction from below. And a variety of new sources came into play. New for me, but to some extent new in the field, I think. First and foremost were municipal records, like those that you see in this image from Manchester, England, that were often quite detailed and revealing. These minutes of city council meetings and other municipal bodies. On the face of it, it looks like boring and uninteresting stuff that you could fall asleep over very readily. But read closely, they turn out to be intriguing records of class contention, of astute strategic maneuvering by small minorities of socialists, and their willingness to kind of fabricate temporary coalitions to achieve their ends, that produced some modest victories along the way, even when they were in small minorities, but also occasionally some large ones. Other valuable local records are party minute books, again, which have to be read closely and intimately, if you will, to really get the meaning. And local correspondence, campaign literature, election data, and the local party press, which was also invaluable. So the research for this book took me to distant and sometimes remote places, not always exotic, although interesting. Places like Broken Hill, New South Wales, which I keep repeating because I found it such a fascinating place, a silver mining town that was really the hub of the Labour Party, the formation of the Labour Party, and which had a municipal socialist government from 1900 on. But also Barcaldine, which was also a kind of competing site for the formation of the Labour Party. Both were deep in the outback of New South Wales and Queensland, respectively. The Grey Mining District in the South Island of New Zealand, the industrial towns and villages of West Yorkshire, and in New Zealand, Christchurch and Dunedin, and a few other cities, Malmö and Växjö, Sweden, and others, Bielefeld and Stuttgart, Germany. The list goes on. These were places that I had the opportunity to do research and benefited from enormously, as well as some larger cities, but like Frankfurt and Vienna and Stockholm and Sydney. And I want to say that on many of these research trips over the course of 23 years of research and writing, I had the companionship and the invaluable research assistance of my wife and partner, Anne Stromquist. So I came to be convinced that cities matter. They mattered then and they matter now. And they're sites where industrialization or economic transformation in all of its profound consequences unfolded, and where class formation took shape in its most pronounced forms. It was also in cities that workers could marshal the kind of strength they needed to challenge existing structures of power in the workplace, but also in civic affairs. 19th century cities were populated by rapidly growing numbers of working class migrants and immigrants who had to cope with the harsh realities of rapid urbanization, in addition to the brutalities and risks of industrial work. It was their numbers and their grievances that fueled political revolt. But cities were also marked by traditions of undemocratic elite governance that in Europe reached back literally centuries, and characterized by long-standing defense of property and commitment by city authorities to minimal public expenditures. I recognized that, and these are the grand city halls, and you know, one of the ways of kind of visualizing this kind of elite power in cities was the way it was signified in the city halls that they constructed. In the case of Bielefeld, going back to the 14th century, but in Manchester, England in 1877. These embodied the kind of elite power that was governing cities up until the late 19th century. I recognized that elite governance in cities that it had deep roots in the development of commerce and markets. And this is not a new insight. Historians of medieval Europe and the early modern state have paid considerable attention to the growth of cities and the jockeying for control of their commerce. It's an interesting story in its own right and pretty ubiquitous. And there's a chapter in the book that deals with this long and convoluted history. But it was where I think it has to be said in the simplest form that where there were cities, there came to be trade and commerce, and cities and their elites who were deeply invested in this trade and commerce had a stake in the way in which those cities would be managed and the ways in which expenditures in particular would be enacted. The elites had a stake in managing cities in such a way as to protect their interests and to minimize their expenditures. This long history of elite governance is important for a couple of reasons, it seems to me. First, it helps to understand the formidable challenge faced by those who pushed for democratization of local governance and public control of municipal services that emerged in the 19th century. This was no mean struggle. I mean, it was a mean struggle, but it was no small struggle. The remarkable ubiquity of municipal franchise restrictions, and this is something that is really, in many ways, at the heart of the story, in one form or another, attests to the challenges that workers faced in trying to undo elite control of these cities. But the second point I want to make about this elite governance is that it's not a one-dimensional story of elites' control. That is, traditional elite governance was itself contested by new elites that came to power with the rise of industrial capitalism. And those elites set about reforming and rationalizing the basic foundations of municipal government. And here the very detailed, but also very astute studies of Sidney and Beatrice Webb in their volumes on local government in England are really very important. But reform-minded manufacturers and their allies were no less committed to the defense of property and their own class interests, though they sought to make city governance more efficient and in some ways to control it even more tightly. They had great influence through municipal reforms in England in 1835, the influence of which spread not only within the colonies of England, but also on the continent of Europe. And third, I want to emphasize that the transnational character of this history of city government, because elite governments was not a uniquely local or parochial phenomenon. It really was quite universal. And although its forms varied somewhat, it was replicated with amazing consistency around the globe. Elites, like workers, were learning from each other about how to protect and preserve, in the case of elites, what they had, the control they had established. In the case of workers, how to challenge that more effectively. And fourth point about elite governance, in recent times, there's a continuing contestation, it seems to me, over municipal home rule. And this, any of you who are active in cities know this to be a case in point. The neoliberal refinement of elite strategies to protect their power and protect their property in municipalities likewise has a transnational character today. But the bottom line, so to speak, is that elite governed cities in the late 19th century were ill-equipped and disinclined to deal with the new social realities of urban life. The threat to large property interests posed by democratically governed cities was very real and a source of ongoing elite panic. So as I dove into this research, I was struck by the shock and the trauma of life for ordinary people in urban areas at the end of the 19th century. And I want to just introduce a few examples. The city of Melbourne, Australia, emerged out of lethargy and a contentious era of politics in the early and mid-decades of the 19th century to enjoy a period of robust growth. The local imagery of what was called marvelous Melbourne in the 1880s, a city of glamour on the civic frontier, shifted to what many called Smellburn, a city, as one commentator noted, wallowing in its own filth, where sickness and death become a hideous reminder of the fundamental interdependence of the social areas of the metropolis. So Smellburn was the reality of life for working people in the marvelous metropolis of the late 19th century. However, as in many cities, the skepticism of what were called ratepayers, that's taxpayers, who were wary about increased taxation, and private contractors who were heavily invested in existing methods of sanitary disposal, hobbled any progress. The industrial suburb of Footscray, in particular, came to be known as the Stinkopolis of the Melbourne municipalities. The suburb's city council liberally dispensed, quote, licenses to driven out capitalists from other industrial suburbs. Things like bone mills and manure works and boiling down places were among the notorious newcomers to the city. The Footscray Council, according to news reports, acted as a welcoming committee. And in 1883, they sacked their inspector of nuisances for submitting too many reports. And so I came across a very vivid account of these conditions in a publication called the Footscray Independent, it published in the spring of 1887, the title of which was Out in a Gondola. And if I can just read a little bit of this report, this account in the newspaper. It was a bright, sunshiny morning when we sailed away in a gallant bark over the odoriferous surface of the saltwater river. Above the railway bridge, pieces of rancid fat, paunches, lights, dead lambs, dogs, etc., line the shores that are burrowed in all directions with the holes of water rats. The gut factory pours in a stream of excrement and gut scrapings. Next, the glue works swamp the shore with hair and parings from hides, and a large pile on shore has accumulated for the rats, ready for removal or being swept into the river when convenient. About 50 feet from the bank opposite this drain, an oar could be pushed down for several feet in the accumulated deposit of decaying putrescence. I love the language here. And even at high water mark, the keel of the boat raised a trail of blood showing how great the deposit was. So this is the kind of world that urban workers in a very fashionable city confronted on a daily basis. This was the consequences of the kind of unregulated and untaxed environment that most workers faced. These conditions, and one of the reasons I use photographs in the book, and that I'm using photographs today, is to try to convey visually how widespread these conditions were and how kind of universally they fueled this kind of new politics that was beginning to emerge. The heart of independent working class politics in Britain was, by any account, the woolen manufacturing city of Bradford, situated in a West Yorkshire valley on whose slopes long rows of working class housing snaked up from the city center to the outlying villages of former outworkers who daily made the trek to the city's woolen mills. F.W. Jowett recalled the social conditions in Bradford when he was elected to the town council in 1892 as a socialist and independent labor representative. Jowett is a really important figure, and he remains active in city politics, and then eventually goes on to be active at the parliamentary level and chaired the Independent Labor Party during the war in a very moving way as an anti-war activist. But he wrote in an autobiography, the houses in which a very large proportion, if not the majority of the working people lived, were like the one in which I was born 28 years before. One room upstairs, one downstairs, and a windowless cellar. The houses were in long streets intersected by passages with privy middens for each block of houses in the backyards. All these houses were built back to back, and therefore they had no through draft for ventilation. Employment, mostly for women and children, was at low wages. Men's work was scarce and irregular, and unemployment among them chronic. No old age pensions or unemployment insurance, no school meals for half-starved children, no school clinics. The dreaded workhouse, still commonly referred to by the people of the working class as the Bastille, was regarded as such. The terrible disease of anthrax, a wool sorter's disease, well known by that name, slums and cellar dwellings, poverty and poverty diseases rampant. In Hamburg, Germany, one could find very similar conditions, if I can find my cursor here. Whoop, jumping ahead. Hamburg was in many ways like so many other industrial cities in this period. It was an old Hansa city, an old port city. In the last decades of the 19th century, it underwent profound changes as a more diversified and more deeply impoverished population grew in size and density. Let me just read a short portion from my own part of the book on this. As in other German cities after the 1890s, Hamburg's workers faced rising poverty, growing congestion, a lack of affordable housing, and a tax structure that bore most heavily on the poorest consumers. Compounding these problems were massive environmental degradation and deteriorating public health conditions highlighted by the catastrophic cholera epidemic of 1892. Chronic problems of human and animal waste, impure water supplies, air pollution, dust, and a lack of access to pure food increased massively after the 1880s, with rapid population growth and spatial expansion in all of Germany's major towns. Visitors to Hamburg spoke of viewing a city as if through a veil of smoke, and a citizens club noted that even in the 1870s, in the outlying impoverished district of Billwerder, Ausschlag, citizens had to wade through a morass in a major thoroughfare that consisted of sewerage, animal waste, and garbage. American cities enjoyed some advantages over their European counterparts. They were generally newer, if still largely unplanned. They enjoyed a more democratic municipal franchise, at least officially. Their robust industrial economies generated significant demand for labor, and at times, at least for skilled labor, comparatively high wages, at least in times of prosperity. However, countless observers noted housing and living conditions in American cities that, by almost any measure, still approximated those in older and more decrepit European cities. The famous photographs of Jacob Riis and Louis Hine were part of a really a kind of worldwide effort to visually document the conditions in American cities and for American workers. And in the US, these traditions of urban social documentary photography were embodied particularly in the work of these two pioneering photographers. But you can also find these images in other places, in Sydney and Wellington and Hamburg and Berlin, that are quite comparable. They were part of an awakening to conditions in city life for urban working people, including detailed documentation found in a variety of studies, like Booth's studies of London, or in the settlement houses, or the Hull House papers in Chicago, or quite famously the Pittsburgh Survey. And it's indeed to Pittsburgh that I want to turn, Pittsburgh and its associated municipalities. Social reformers in Pittsburgh who conducted the Pittsburgh Survey sought to identify what they called piled up actualities that would give the human measure of the Industrial Revolution. Historian Roy Lubov summarized their findings for the city of Homestead, which was the Carnegie Corporation dominated suburb of Pittsburgh. Homestead's water supply was drawn from the Monongahela, polluted by sewage from the numerous towns and villages, as well as industrial wastes and acid discharges from the mines. Individuals sunk wells, but these were frequently contaminated by seepage from the privy vaults. Margaret Byington, who conducted the research for the survey on Homestead, studied 21 different living courts of working class folks in Homestead, where, quote, yards, toilets, and water supply were all in common usage. In these courts lived, according to Byington, in these courts lived 239 families. 168 were Slovaks, 22 Hungarians, 16 Russians, 10 Poles, 23 Slavs of other origins. 102 took in lodgers. 51 families, including sometimes 4 or 5 people, lived in one-room tenements. One half of the families used their kitchens as sleeping rooms. Of the 3 houses, only 3 houses had running water inside, and in at least 3 instances, over 110 people were dependent on one yard for hydrant, hydrant yard in a yard for water. Louis Hine actually did much of the documentary photography that accompanied the Pittsburgh Survey, and in particular, Byington's volume. And these photographs by Hine not only had the mark of stunning visual images, but the ironic and bitter captions that he affixed to these photographs, so that this was in Heinz' view, a spontaneous recreation center in Homestead in 1907. In another image, he always tried to connect with his subjects, and the child labor photographs are particularly characteristic in that regard. But in this one, he titled "In Carnegie's Footsteps." These were the next generation of Carnegies, so to speak. And then the brook in Munhall Hollow, now to all intents an open drain. Its toleration is a crime against health and childhood. And then one more image, not of Hein, but of Jacob Riis, that again, like the Hamburg image, conveys the outside privies that were in common use in tenements in New York City, circa 1890, when Riis was completing his initial set of photographs. The shock of urban living conditions globally became an energizing force behind the municipal socialist reforming zeal. And the second point of this presentation, I'm only on the second point, unfortunately, that I want to emphasize is how workers responded by inventing a new experimental local politics. Several factors contributed to the new social and political alchemy of these years. Obviously, the precarious and intolerable living conditions were an important factor, but so were conditions at the workplace, in the mines, on the railroads, on the docks, in manufacturing and construction sites. And those conditions precipitated a worldwide wave of mass strikes in the early 1890s, involving hundreds of thousands of workers who challenged the dominance of their employers and the repressive powers of the state. Some of the most vivid images of this labor conflict in the early to mid 1890s comes from the Pullman strike and boycott, and that's a whole subject unto itself. But they were illustrative of the kind of intensity of labor conflict that was precipitated in these years, and that came to be captured by the phrase "the Great Upheaval" in the United States. But it wasn't just in the United States. This Great Upheaval was also erupting around the world. On the London docks, among sheep shearers and silver miners, in the Australian outback, dock workers on the wharves of Sydney and Wellington, among textile workers in Bradford, England, Stuttgart, Germany, railroad workers in Chicago, of course, and across the West, and coal miners in Germany and elsewhere. This image from the strike in 1892, the silver miners' strike in Broken Hill, conveys the intensity of the conflict, in which women were very much actors, but also the image itself does not convey, but it was strikes like this that became the kind of precipitant for a new politics that took shape in these places. So with the propulsion of these labor struggles and faced with repressive governments nationally and locally, workers gave birth to a new politics that challenged class power, first and foremost in their cities. My book tries to describe this new municipal organizing in a wide range of cities during these years. But one of the leading cases, it seems to me, has to be the big Manningham textile strike in Bradford, England, that broke out in December of 1890 and lasted for 19 weeks. Some 5,000 workers struck, again, a massive strike that, according to E.P. Thompson, cracked the two-party system and led to the formation of the Independent Labor Party. Women played key roles in this strike, as well as so many others. The strike lasses, as they were called, were both active on the streets, but also soliciting strike support in neighboring towns and communities. A critical moment in this strike came with the violent breakup of a mass meeting in the town square, April 13th, 1891. You can see in this newspaper image, imperfect though it is, the image of the city hall that we saw in a previous slide looming in the background. This strike, among its many other important features, was a strike that, because of the involvement of local government in repressing the strike, really turned the attention of workers even more directly on the municipality. Ben Tillett, who spoke at a mass meeting on April 23rd, said, "At election times, the people can teach would-be Caesars, town clerks, and mayors and watch committees a salutary lesson." And Charlie Glide, another local leader, said, "We have had two parties in the past, the can'ts and the won'ts, and it's time we had a party that will." And so, indeed, in Bradford and elsewhere, workers turned to local politics for some redress. These the strikes as precipitants of political mobilization are, again, a kind of worldwide phenomenon. One that I know best and that I studied to some degree was a streetcar strike in Cleveland in 1899. An image here shows the crowd essentially surrounding, well, not essentially, indeed surrounding a streetcar and keeping it from its appointed route. But the streetcar strikes very often had a direct impact on local politics, and that was certainly the case in Cleveland, where the existing two-party alignment was juggled, at least for a time, and a new reformed Democratic Party under Tom Johnson was constituted. But streetcar strikes in Brisbane, Australia, and Wellington, New Zealand, Milwaukee, among other places, were ubiquitous and had a very powerful impact. In these experimental days, small victories could be cumulative and produce big results. And new party formations of a variety of kinds took shape as an expression of this new political impulse. In this context, I want to turn back just again fairly briefly to talk about the debate about revisionism as it intersected with the emergence of this new politics. And in the book, I have a great deal to say about this, particularly with respect to the German case, but also in the US. The debate over revisionism was vehement and it was personal. Many of the protagonists were themselves well acquainted within the socialist movement. But what is often overlooked in discussions of these socialist debates is this new atmosphere of political experimentalism that swept through working class communities in the 1890s. Theoreticians and activists alike drew different conclusions from the unfolding events. Witnessing the birth of the Independent Labor Party in Britain, Edward Bernstein noted from exile, quote, "What made sense yesterday can be nonsense today." And then while he saw moments where the, quote, political strike can work, where the ruling classes and the powers that be miscalculate, where a succession of industrial crises, political mismanagement, and deep discontent prevail, he also professed extraordinarily little feeling for or interest in what is usually termed, quote, the final goal of socialism. For him, the movement is everything. Quote, that again is another quote from Bernstein. At one point in the debate over revisionism, he wrote, "It is my firm conviction that even the present generation will see the realization of a good deal of socialism, if not in the patented form, then at least in fact. The steady expansion of the sphere of social obligations, i.e., obligations of the individual towards society, his corresponding rights and his obligations of society toward individuals, the extension of rights of the right of society as organized in the nation or the state to regulate economic life, the growth of democratic self-government in municipalities, in districts and provinces, and the extended responsibilities of these bodies. For me, all these things mean development towards socialism, or, if you will, piecemeal realization of socialism." And it was the piecemeal part that I think most stuck in the craw of some of his antagonists. But Bernstein was also quite cognizant of and aware of the special, what he called the special place for municipal socialism within the wider working class movement, quote, as an indispensable lever for forming or completely realizing the democratic right of labor. So as socialists struggled to build power in cities, in the beginning, there was often a sense of isolation, when only a handful of socialists were initially elected to local councils, or when the percentage of the popular vote seemed wholly inadequate. But they discovered in the value, as I've said before, of trench warfare in local government, where as sites of class struggle that saw entrenched elites fighting to resist piecemeal changes. They were mightily aware of the value of the, quote, bully pulpit and the procedural challenges that they might mount even as a minority. And they cobbled together temporary coalitions where they could and built a base of support. Their tactics were fundamentally similar, whether in Hamilton, Ohio, or Vienna, Austria, or Bradford, England, or Milwaukee, or Malmö, Sweden. Edward Hartley, a butcher, and Fred Jowett, a textile worker, were at the outset part of a small socialist minority in the Bradford City Council. They were socialists, but they were also pragmatists. As Jowett, whom I quoted before, put it in 1907, quote, as socialists, we might still aspire to establish a socialist city where there will be bread for all, work for all, and no fireless grates. But the toll taken on the stunted victims themselves necessitated a more practical, if circuitous, path forward. The socialist must needs work his passage to the socialist city by means of municipal trading, housing reform, municipal milk supply, and education. Hartley's experience is representative of this new engagement in local politics. He stands in some ways for other municipal socialists elected during these years around the world. They were often uphill and without immediate rewards, but Hartley left us a diary of his work in which he recounted in some detail some of his efforts. And I want to just quote a brief passage from his diary that conveys the kind of intensity of struggle that these folks were engaged in. He shattered the clubby decorum, as he referred to it, that ruled the council chambers, whether liberals or Tories dominated. He challenged the routine election of committee chairs, balked at salary increases for city engineers when employees who collected night soil had been denied raises, and gave a fellow councillor, quote, such a basting as he will never forget and probably never forgive, over a proposal by the councillor that unsanitary conditions in poor neighborhoods should simply be subject to, quote, natural evolution. On one occasion, faced with constant interruptions and heckling from conservatives on the council, quote, who had evidently been in the club room and who challenged the facts in his comments on the water supply for poor neighborhoods. An exasperated Hartley turned to them and declared, if you'd get less whiskey, you'd soon know a great deal more. He noted in his diary that there was a silence one could feel. And I'm, tempting as it is to recount so many other instances of this kind of hand-to-hand combat in city councils. I think, I hope I've conveyed the sense of what this was like. In Milwaukee, of course, this municipal politics, what was called, this is Edward Hartley. I meant to put this up sooner. In his election, his municipal program when he ran for election in 1900. But Milwaukee was, as many of us know, that was the kind of quintessential example of socialists building from the foundations of an urban populism in alliance with the Federated Trades Council to build an effective municipal politics that came to power in 1910. And before they came to power, they were winning elections, but not in the numbers they needed to control events in Milwaukee, and that didn't stop them from putting forward motions that they knew were going to be defeated, but which essentially established a kind of baseline, a programmatic baseline for what they wanted to achieve when they came to power. And so they were things like equitable expenditure for street repairs, a municipal ice plant and coal and wood yard, creating space and speaker stands for open air meetings in public parks, soliciting bids for a long promised children's isolation hospital, the 8-hour day for municipal employees, and on, eventually proposing to municipalize electricity and light and telephone companies. All of these proposals were put forward. They garnered exactly 9 votes, the socialists who were on the council during those initial years. But they nevertheless created the foundation for this politics going forward. When they came to power in 1910, they managed in the space of that first 2 years in elected office to accomplish an amazing degree, a large part of what they had proposed. And again, if I had more time, I would give you more detail on that. But this was their campaign book in 1912, as so often happened in these years. Milwaukee socialists, although they won in 1910, went down to defeat, at least partial defeat, in 1912. They lost control of city council and the mayor's office. But they would then be reelected in 1916 and then hold office on and off for a good deal of the next several decades. So let me just turn, and this is very brief because I really haven't done my own excavating on the ground, so to speak. So this is largely based on the work of other people. But in Minneapolis, as you know, municipal socialists gained a foothold with the election of Thomas Van Leer as mayor in 1916, although they did not control the city council at that point. He had run unsuccessfully in 1910 and 12. He was a machinist. But their success, and Van Leer only held office for 2 years. This, of course, was wartime, and the conditions in wartime were tumultuous for socialists because of their opposition to the war. Van Leer kind of straddled the fence on that question, but nevertheless, his administration found it very, very difficult, not only to get anything done substantially, or more importantly, to be reelected in 1918. Nonetheless, it's an important episode and one that is worthy of attention. It's been written about a good deal. One that hasn't been written about a good deal, at least to my knowledge, is the case of Two Harbors, Minnesota. And I just want to briefly discuss it and give some highlights, because it, after all, is part of your local history. The city of Two Harbors, in some ways, is an instructive microcosm of how workers fought to wrest local politics from the clutches of corporate control. In this case, the major corporation controlling city politics was the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad. And this struggle was ongoing. Two Harbors was a major transportation hub for iron ore shipping through the Great Lakes, and had an ethnically diversified working class, largely Scandinavian, but also Irish, Finns, some Germans, along with many native-born migrants, many of whom worked on the railroad. Local politics was dominated by corporate interests. The Republican Party had been hegemonic, but in the 1890s had grown deeply factionalized and created new political space for other new political formations that were grounded in the needs and interests of workers. Initially a populist, then a populist democratic fusion, eventually a public ownership party that morphed in turn into a local socialist party. But what I think is interesting, and I mean, there are many things that are interesting about this story, but and many of the parts of this story line up with the experience of other municipalities, not only in the US, but around the world. But what's interesting, I think, in particular, is that from 1904 on, the Municipal Socialists in Two Harbors enjoyed rising success. They elected mayors in 1907 and 1911 under the aegis of the Public Ownership Party. They elected a full socialist administration in 1913 and 15, and lost the mayoral election, but elected many city councilmen in 1917. They took back power in 1919, and as a now trade union ticket, succeeded in winning in 1921. And socialists remained significantly present in all of these political incarnations. By the early 20s, the political momentum was shifting toward farmer laborism locally and statewide. But this is a remarkably sustained case of socialist success in the face of very concerted elite efforts to undermine their viability. In particular, organizing what was called a Citizens Progressive League that merged Republicans and Democrats to try to throw the socialists out of office. This history of Two Harbors and the socialist success there has been, as far as I can tell, largely erased from public consciousness. Not much evidence of it if you go to the Two Harbors municipal website. Perhaps in local museums, I don't know. But not much out there that recounts this very vivid history. And my rendering of it draws almost entirely on the work of a Swedish labor historian, Jimmy Engren, who for a period of time was a former student of mine as well, and who did a dissertation really on Two Harbors and its working class and its socialist politics. So I'm going on and on here, and there's a lot more I would love to be able to share with you, but I'm fearful of doing so at the expense of any time for. Hang on, I got to get back to. I do want to just highlight Carolyn Martin, who was an independent Labor Party organizer and Christian socialist in England. And there's a particularly vivid account of Martin and her effect on local consciousness. This was the account of an observer from the town of Eagly. This is in West Yorkshire, and he remembered that, quote, I knew nothing of the subject of socialism and did not care to learn much about it. But for curiosity's sake, I took my seat on a tree stump that Friday evening when Carolyn Martin came to Eagly to speak in the open air. In the company of some 200 or 300 people, I listened to an exposition of socialistic principles, illustrated and interspersed with the sayings and doings of the carpenter of Nazareth. My wonder at what seemed to me the intrepidity and courage of a young and defenseless woman grew and changed to amazement at myself that I had never seen these things in this light before. She had spoken as no woman ever spoke before in my hearing. Scales fell from my eyes, and ere long, I was a socialist. There was a kind of evangelism, if you will, to put a positive spin on that term, about the movement in many places that had a real transformative effect on people's lives on a personal level. And I love this story for that reason. One of the maps in the book that you can take some time looking at if you have a chance. These are towns and cities that had socialist administrations at one point or another between 1898 and 1922. And the larger dots represent multiple administrations. The smaller dots, the very small dots, a single administration. But it gives you some sense of the geographic spread of this movement and the way in which it took root and lasted in many, many municipalities. I'm going to jump through some other slides. Jim Thorne, my New Zealand labor activist who embodied this kind of transnational, translocal spirit, went to England and organized for the Independent Labour Party going from New Zealand and then returning to become active again in the New Zealand Labour Party on his return. He was a very powerful and charismatic individual. The wartime, of course, and the anti-conscription and anti-war elements of the movement that took shape, particularly in the face of hardship that workers in cities faced. And then at the end of the war, the kind of democratic surge that in Germany took the shape of workers and soldiers councils that spread very quickly after the collapse of the Reich, and that had an enormous impact in, at least for a while, in remaking city government in alliance with the independent Social Democratic Party activists like Tony Sender in Frankfurt, Germany, who was a leader of the revolutionary city government for a period of time in 1918 and 1919. But the culmination of this story, of this period anyway, as I've said, was Red Vienna. And Jakob Reumann was a woodturner, city councilor in Vienna, and was elected the first socialist mayor of the city in 1919. He served only until 1923, at which time he chose to step aside and let younger members of the party assume his leadership. He was revered for this gesture. And Jakob Reumann and the socialists in Vienna managed in the space of roughly 15 years before their movement was crushed by the Nazis to establish a kind of powerful model that echoed worldwide for what socialists in power can do, particularly with respect to public housing. And they were able to do that because under the new constitution at the end of the war, Vienna was made, the city of Vienna was made a province unto itself, which gave it taxing power. And that taxing power enabled it to restructure local taxes in a way that local elites had resisted adamantly there and elsewhere. And it was on that basis that they were able to fund these massive social work, public works that really transformed the city. One of my, and I'll end with this, and we can talk about the present later. One of my favorite quotations, actually, of this period comes from the Australian Worker, which was following developments in Vienna very closely. And in 1925, they wrote, "The socialist most hated in Vienna by the well-to-do is certainly Hugo Breitner." Hugo Breitner? "Speak to them of Lenin, Trotsky, or Liebknecht, and they will listen with perfect calm. But mention the name Breitner, and the calm is replaced by fury and hate. He is credited with the intention of destroying the whole economic life of Vienna. In reality, he is merely the author of the financial policy of the municipal council. Breitner's new tax scheme introduced 18 new taxes, which chiefly hit those who can afford to pay, and abolished 1 or 2 old taxes, which burdened the workers unfairly." So this was this then was the model that people looked to, and to some extent, there was actually a very interesting article in the New York Times in May of 23 called "The Renter's Utopia," which documented the extent to which this social housing of the Red Vienna period is still very much alive and well in Vienna today, and where renters in public housing pay no more than 8% of their income for rent, and that a vast majority of residents actually rent in the city. And the city officials and the public connect this very much with that period of Red Vienna when the city was transformed and its public housing infrastructure was rebuilt. So let me stop there. It seems to me we could talk about the legacy of these years and how they've shaped or are shaping politics today. But I'd be very interested in hearing any comments or thoughts any of you have about that or about any of what I've talked about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. We have some questions in the chat as well, so I'm gonna bring Peter back in to moderate the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Shell.
Yeah, welcome.
Our first question is from our comrade in Texas, Chad Pearson. And he asks, can you talk about the relationship and or tensions between municipal socialism and revolutionary socialism, especially in the context of the Russian Revolution?
Well, of course, that was another model that socialists were very much entranced with, and I think it was a model that, you know, I mean, I would go back actually to the Paris Commune, which in some ways was the revolutionary embodiment of this municipal politics in an earlier era in 1871. It was obviously, as we know, brutally repressed. But there was a sense in which whether quote revolutionary or not, and whether prepared to engage in violence or not, socialists in Paris, and I think probably in Russia as well, were seen as constructing a new social order, and one that municipal socialists, however many differences they might have had as to methods and strategy, nonetheless identified with to some extent. This was building a workers' society, and to that degree, I think they felt a kind of affinity for it. Now, you know, this was a period, the Russian Revolution period, and its aftermath, and even earlier, the Paris Commune period, was a source of considerable division among socialists as well. So there were certainly those who were more or considerably less infatuated with this model of how to bring about socialism. But I think at some level, there was a sense that in terms of reconstructing society and workers being the agents of that reconstruction, there was a tendency to identify with both of those episodes.
So, Shell, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Oh, yeah.
And we could get a rogues
Good.
gallery of mugshots up here.
Good idea. Let me.
Chad, do you want to come back at that response?
No, I think it's great. I appreciate your comments and really enjoy learning from you. You know, I've seen some documents of critics who lump it all together, the municipal folks and the more revolutionary folks. And so, you know, I'm looking at, I study, as you know, people I dislike, and you know, they you know, do the lumping, but I appreciate your comments. Definitely see the differences in those models. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
Are there other questions out there? Well, while we're waiting to see Shell, I have to ask, I don't think I heard you use the term sewer socialism. And I wonder if you might talk about how that was used as a pejorative, perhaps, and why you're staying away from it.
Well, I mean, I guess I do stay away from it, just because it has been used in such a pejorative way. I mean, these people were very much into the material transformation of daily life in cities at the most basic level, and it did involve sanitation and sewers. And it did involve, creating kind of municipal entities that would better manage. One of the quotes I didn't give you was from F.W. Jowett, who mocked his opponents in city council, who said they thought that people needed to have business acumen to serve on city council, that your workers didn't come equipped with that kind of acumen, and that therefore they were really not appropriate to represent the people. And then Jowett went through the whole list of things in which the existing city council had failed to demonstrate business acumen. But they were often made fun of because of their obsession, if you will, with improving the conditions of daily life at the most basic level. And and there are lots of very interesting anecdotes about that. In Germany, for instance, someone said, how do you spend Saturday debating the transformation of society along socialist lines at the highest levels, and on Monday in city council debate how to get streetlights into an unlit neighborhood? How do you do both of those things, right? And that was what at least many of these folks claimed they were able to do. They were trying to do. These were incremental but important steps on the road. And this is a whole other answer to a question that no one asked, but the differences between middle class reformers and municipal socialists were really quite striking. And even though there were times, particularly in terms of improvements in sanitation, where municipal socialists were able to cobble together a coalition with middle-class reformers on the councils, there were issues on which they were absolutely unable to come to agreement, and they had to do with things like the conditions of work and payment and hours for municipal employees. The municipal socialists saw municipal employment, public employment, as a kind of way to establish a model that would carry over into the private sector, right? That it would influence the way in which employers had to or were constrained to deal with their employees. And also taxation. I mean, taxation, you know, even middle-class reformers were reluctant to really, in any kind of fundamental way, tinker with the tax structure in ways that would have created the kind of public funding that Red Vienna came up with, and the kind of, therefore, transformative changes in housing and recreation and public facilities that was possible. So there were times when middle-class reformers and municipal socialists could make common cause, but there were certainly times when they could not. And municipal socialists were quite clear who and for what purposes their allies were.
Thank you. Our friend Deb, who is here also from Texas. Deb, you got your hand up. You wanna unmute and even turn on your video and ask your question. Deb? Well.
Oh,
there we
hi,
go.
sorry about that.
Cool.
Hi.
Hey, Deb, hi.
Hi. Wonderful seeing you, Shel, and hearing your talk. I was wondering if you could speak to the development of municipal chambers of commerce and the role of the Chamber of Commerce in fighting socialism at the municipal level.
Yeah. Well, it came in many forms, and some of them were, ostensibly civic organizations of businessmen that were promoting the kind of well-being of the city. Usually that meant keeping it non-union, and usually it meant minimal public expenditure, or kind of restrained public expenditure, and limited, if at all, expansion of the public sector at the municipal level. So Chamber of Commerce has certainly come along in the 20th century and become advocates for the interests of business taxpayers and business interests in the municipality, and they almost always, at some early point, clashed with the programs that municipal socialists were trying to promote. I saw this up close in Iowa City many years ago, when near the time that I first came here, when we elected a woman named Karen Cubby to the city council, who was a socialist, and explicitly a socialist, and she had a program and wanted to push this program, and it was very clear to me that the business group in town, the Downtown Chamber of Commerce, was very eager to thwart her at every turn. And even though she was the only socialist on the city council at that time, and she could occasionally cobble together, for some kinds of issues, supporters on the margins, but she almost always faced direct opposition from the Downtown Chamber of Commerce, and to her credit, she was very effective, even as a single socialist member of the city council. She was very determined. She was very optimistic. She would talk to anybody, but she was very clear about what her program was. Well, so that and when it came to politics, municipal socialists, where they were elected, almost always faced fusion of Democratic and Republican parties, at least temporarily, for an election or two, until the socialist threat had been undermined and weakened, and then they would fall back. But these were led by businessmen. In Dayton, Ohio, the other thing that the business community engineered was a restructuring of local government along two lines in particular. One was getting rid of the ward system, which had enabled socialists to elect councilors from working class wards in numbers that were not acceptable to the business class. So creating an at-large city council election meant that the votes of workers were diluted in the whole city. And this was a reform that was promoted all around the country, but it was particularly effective in Dayton, where socialists were getting 45% of the vote, but they were electing 0 city councilors in 1917, 1918, 1919. And it was part because they were able to rewrite the city charter in a way that got rid of that, but also instituted a city manager system that essentially took from city council a lot of the responsibility and authority for managing and doing the work of the city, and so weakened the city council. But anyway, the business organizations at the local level were very powerful opponents of municipal socialists.
Thank you so much.
We have a question from Will Cooley.
Hey, Will.
Which is Will, do you want to come on and ask it yourself? There he is.
Hey, Shel, great presentation.
Hey,
but I do also a little bit of context. I was at a meeting today on homelessness encampments, and I drove through one on the way home from it. And there was a discussion. We do have some, very left-leaning, I would say, socialist city council people in Minneapolis. And there was a discussion of bringing them into the discussion of what to do. And people had like belly laughs about like they're just not interested in doing stuff about this, right? And I see this with blocking housing and just this inability to really govern.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you see it, like the people you're featuring, man, they made working people's lives better, and they really, put their noses to the grindstone and said sewers and stuff like that is important. And I just don't see it today. I see something different.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are several things I would say. One is, how do we hold these people accountable once they're elected? In Hamilton, Ohio, which is a far cry from socialist politics today, but in 1912, 1914 had a socialist local government. And those city councilors who were elected by the party to city council had to appear every month at the Socialist Party meeting and account for what they were doing in council. They could not be disconnected from the party base that had elected them. And I see that today. A lot of progressive elected officials, and a lot of, in some cases, obviously in the case you're talking about, socialist elected officials are kind of disconnected and don't feel a sense of obligation to the people who got them into that office. And it seems to me one of the things that we ought to be trying to do today, these days, is reinvigorate that kind of party claim on our elected officials, and make them held accountable. I mean, our Iowa City Federation of Labor has all the candidates for city council come and make a presentation to the city fed. And that's good. That's good. Because then we kind of know where they stand. But there's no follow-up in terms of once they're elected, holding them accountable. And that seems to be one of the things that we really need to figure out how to do. I mean, part of what's running through this whole history is a struggle against nonpartisanism, because the elites always claimed, oh, we don't have parties, we don't have party interests, and these socialists are coming in and they're beholden to their political parties. That's not a good thing for governing a city. We got to have people who have the interests of the city as a whole in mind. Well, hogwash, that it ought to be about parties, and it ought to be about parties exercising control over the people that they elect, and what they do. Yeah, no, so that's a good example.
Thanks, Shel, and thanks for the question, Will. Maybe time for one more. John Hanson, you have a question? Ooh, John, did you push the wrong button?
There I am.
Oh,
It's
good.
kind of like a follow-up on Will's question. And that is, do you see effective socialist city councils or even members in city councils that are getting an effect, that are listening to the needs of the community and bringing these things before the city councils? Do you see that happening anywhere?
Well, I had I'm not as well acquainted as I would like to be with the kind of new municipalism that is kind of percolating around the country. But I was on a panel on May Day. It was actually a year ago in 2023 with a woman from Richmond, California, where over the course of several years, this local grassroots movement, which I don't know that they called themselves socialists, but they certainly had those aspirations, were able to win numbers of city council elections, and in the end, over again, it was several years, flipped control of city council from Chevron, which was the corporation that really ran things in Richmond, to a popularly elected and responsive party. I'm forgetting now. I should go back to my notes, but what the name of this? I mean, it is a party-like entity. In other words, they ran candidates for specific offices and they hold them accountable. I'm sure there are other cases around the country where broadly defined municipal socialists are having some success and are exercising some control over what's done by their elected members in city councils. But Richmond is the one case that comes to mind. If people know of others, I would really be delighted to know. But
be nice to have them for this.
What's that? Did somebody have a suggestion of another place, or?
I thank you for your answer. I'm having some trouble with my mute button here.
Okay. Yeah. No, but I'm serious. If people if you Google new municipalism, I think you'll find an array of organizations that are really doing important grassroots political work at the city level these days, and really have a vision of what a kind of new kind of municipal socialist movement might look like. But,
new municipalism. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. And I see Steve Brandt has a question. Steve, do you want to unmute and ask the question yourself?
I can do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am here. Let me turn off one of my. So what I'm trying to ask is your presentation focused largely on the programmatic side of what municipal socialists sought to enact. And I'm wondering about the flip side, the funding of municipal government that's traditionally derived from property taxation. Some of us in Minneapolis are beginning to explore the utility of a city level income or wealth tax to offset the regressivity of the property tax system. What did municipal socialists prescribe?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of ideas out there that people were playing with in terms of how to restructure municipal finance. I think what, again, going back to Red Vienna as an example, I think what they well, first of all, they got rid of all consumption taxes, which are totally regressive. But I think they instituted both a tax on wealth, but also a tax on property that was graduated, that it was a progressive property tax, so that those who were property owners at the higher level obviously paid a lot more, and they screamed about it. But there was a lot of interest early on among municipal socialists in Henry George's single tax idea. And this was a tax on the unearned increment in property values that came with, speculative manipulation of property. And in Cleveland, for instance, where it wasn't a socialist government, but it was the progressive government of Tom Johnson, his socialist ally in that government, Peter Witt, was put in charge of restructuring property taxes in a way that would make them more progressive. And he was, roundly criticized. But indeed, that was undertaken, probably not on the full scale that many municipal socialists would have liked to see, or that Red Vienna did undertake, but nevertheless moved property taxes in a much more progressive direction. And indeed, it generated revenue that the Johnson administration in Cleveland was able to use to, among other things, municipalize water and electricity, and begin to do some other things to address the needs of working class neighborhoods that wouldn't have been possible without additional revenue. So I think it's worth looking more closely at the proposals that were being put forward. But I haven't done that. I can't say I've done that systematically, but there was certainly an interest in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shel. I think the questions have really given us a great example of what we like to call at the Eastside Freedom Library, promoting a conversation between the past and the present. And people are here, we respect history, we research history, we care about history, but we really care about the present and the future, and what we can learn from history. And thank you so much for
Peter, let me just, if I may, just say one more thing, and that is that what I think people fail to realize, many people fail to realize, is the kind of municipal socialism that they have all around them in many cities. That's a legacy of this period, and And it's being contested. You know, it's being contested right and left by neoliberals who want to shrink the public sector, who want to deunionize public sector workers, and who want to remake cities in a very different and kind of old way that the municipal socialists were fighting hard against. So, you know, public transportation and parks and sanitation and water, and in some places electricity, and in some places cable television, you know, there's a public infrastructure that we've won and we control, but it's under siege and we have to continue to fight for. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you to.
Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed
Thank you,
your
Shel.
questions and a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shelton, for this very thought-provoking presentation and Q&A, and to Peter and the team at Eastside Freedom Library for partnering with us on this event, and to all of you, thank you for attending. And we hope to see you at a future event. The link to Shelton's book, which has more of the information on the presentation that he gave today, is available now, and through a variety of different places. So be sure to check that out. Great. And thank you all again. And I hope you have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone. Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.